Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma. Let's get started. Sri Lanka is on the boil. The Prime Minister has stepped down. The protests show no sign of ending. In fact, it looks even more volatile now. The emergency is on, a curfew is on, people have died in today's protests, many have been injured. And this was a majority government, remember, led by the country's most powerful political dynasty. Until 2 months back, more than 5 Rajapaksas were ministers. Today, just the president is left, and he too is clutching at the straws. This is a story of what a people's protest can achieve. Months of financial crisis push Sri Lankans to the edge. The Rajapaksas, once the favourite of the Sinhala majority, have now been shunned by all, including the powerful Buddhist monks, not to mention their friends in Beijing, the ones who are said to have supported their campaign and caught Sri Lanka in a debt trap. Almost 2 decades back, Mahinda Rajapaksa fought a ruthless war against the LTT and achieved what no Sri Lankan president before him could. Today, he's lost the battle with his people. It is an incredible story. It's our cover story tonight. For weeks, we've been telling you about the crisis in Sri Lanka, the worst ever financial crisis, then the political crisis, then the protests. Now, this is a tiny island of 65,000 square kilometers, population 2.2 crores, slightly more than that of Delhi. Why should an endless protest in this country make our top story day after day? Because it's a spectacular story of democracy and how people suffer when they vote inefficient leaders, of dictatorship and how too much power corrupts, and of debt, how friendship with China leaves you in a mess. In 2019, the Rajapaksas came to power with a brute majority, a 2/3 majority. 3 years down the line, the Prime Minister has had to step down. The President is struggling to survive. They treated their country like a private limited company. Now the real stakeholders are pushing them out of power. The people are protesting and prevailing. And China, their friendly lender, is nowhere to be seen. I want to start this story with images of Sri Lanka. This is what it looks like today. Sri Lanka is under emergency and Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa's resignation has not eased the tension. If anything, the situation looks worse now. A curfew has been clamped. Soldiers are out on the streets. There were clashes through the day today. At least 2 people have died, one of them a lawmaker from the ruling party. More than 100 others are injured. Will Mahinda Rajapaksa's exit ease the protest? Or will the protesters settle for nothing less than President Gotabaya's ouster? Tonight, we'll bring you the latest from a country that has turned into a powder keg. On Friday, we told you about a cabinet meeting. It had been called by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. He wanted his elder brother and Prime Minister Mahinda to go. Gota refused to resign himself. He called for a unity government and for the exit of his brother. Mahinda's office denied the reports. A tense weekend followed. Staying in office looked increasingly difficult for him. Even his supporters sensed the inevitable. This morning, they gathered outside Temple Trees. Temple Trees is the official residence of the Sri Lankan Prime Minister. What were they there for? Apparently to ask Rajapaksa to not step down. Well, that's what some reports say. Others say that these people did not come on their own. They were brought in on buses from across Sri Lanka. Well, whatever the backstory, once they were at Temple Trees, they began chanting pro-Rajapaksa slogans. Now, you know who else has been camping outside the Prime Minister's residence? Protesters. They've been there for several weeks now. They've set up camps. Rajapaksa supporters stormed these camps today. Within minutes, clashes erupted. The situation got out of hand quickly. Rajapaksa supporters destroyed the protest site. They set fire to the tents. Leader of opposition Sajith Premadasa rushed to the site. With him were other politicians and trade union leaders. Reports say they were also attacked. A drone captured the moment when Premadasa was escorted away from the scene. There was absolute carnage after that. Angry protesters attacked several buses. We cannot confirm which camp they belonged to. Some of them went after the buses, the same buses that are said to have brought in those supporters. One of them was dumped in a pool of water nearby. Soon the violence spread across the country. At least 2 offices were set on fire. These belonged to different politicians and parties. Public property was destroyed. Government vehicles were set on fire. Members of the Rajapaksa family posted appeals for restraint on social media. But they were sharply criticized by all sides, by anti-government protesters, by critics, activists, journalists, everyone, including former cricketers of Sri Lanka. Then came the resignation. Mahinda Rajapaksa confirmed that he was indeed stepping down. This came 3 hours after his appeal for restraint. And he wasn't the only one to go. 2 ministers have quit with him. Health Minister Channa Jayasumana and Minister of Labour Vidura Vikramanayake. Our correspondent in Colombo, Dasuniya Thauda, was at Temple Trees, the Prime Minister's residence, when all of this happened.
Protesters continue to gather here outside the Temple Trees, which is the official residence of Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, demanding for him to leave not only the Prime Minister but also the Gotabaya Rajapaksa-led government to simply stand down. Now, protests today took a violent turn where, as of right now, over 130 individuals have been hospitalized following clashes, where a shootout has also taken place in Niptambua, where reports are now showing that one of those injured appear to be critical.
So what happens next? President Gotabaya Rajapaksa is yet to accept these resignations, but Mahinda says his resignation is effective immediately. Reports say the president has offered key posts to the opposition. Leader of opposition Sajith Premadasa was invited to become Prime Minister. Apparently he's refused. That's because their demands have been only half met. The opposition and the protesters want the president to go too. Going by their slogans, they're unlikely to accept today's concessions. A state of emergency, like I told you, was declared in Sri Lanka on Friday. Was President Rajapaksa then anticipating this violence? Why did the police force not rein in his supporters? They've been caught on camera wreaking havoc on the streets of Colombo today. Will action against them follow? These are questions that are being asked. Sri Lanka looks like a war zone. There are soldiers on the streets. The Rajapaksas once ruled Sri Lanka with an iron fist. They defied the rules. They ruled with impunity. Gotabaya Rajapaksa still occupies the president's chair, but he has lost the authority to rule. The Rajapaksa political empire is crumbling. The story of protesters taking down the powerful is not over. And it's been quite a turnaround. Until last year, Mahinda Rajapaksa looked invincible. His grip on power was absolute. He controlled the parliament. His family controlled 75% of the country's budget. The Rajapaksa family ruled Sri Lanka, and Mahinda was the face of the dynasty. He was South Asia's longest-serving leader. Today, he's a deposed prime minister. He was once the hero of the civil war. Today, he's the fall guy in Colombo, a political liability sacrificed by his younger brother, the president. Our next report tells you about the rise and fall of Mahinda Rajapaksa.
Mahinda Rajapaksa once described himself as a rebel with a cause. He belongs to a political dynasty, but his brand of politics is hardly that of a dynast. Rajapaksa has the reputation of a street fighter. He entered parliament in 1970 when he was just 24. He became Sri Lanka's youngest ever parliamentarian. Rajapaksa had won from Hambantota, the same region that his father, Da Rajapaksa, had represented. It was a good start, but his big break came 3 decades later. In 2015, Mahinda became the president, starting a decade-long reign. His presidency lasted till 2015 and oversaw one of the bloodiest wars in modern history. With his brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, Mahinda went on the offensive. Rajapaksa crushed the Tamil Tigers, the group his predecessors failed to tame. He rose to power, projecting himself as a man of peace. But as president, he ended the peace process. Mahinda's ruthless streak defined his political career. With his brother, Gotabaya, Mahinda went on the offensive. By 2009, the LTTE was defeated. Their leader, Vellupillai Prabhakaran, was gunned down. The victory came at a huge cost. Going by one United Nations estimate, 40,000 Tamils died in the final offensive. Mahinda Rajapaksa was accused of human rights violations, a charge that he vehemently denies. The victory over LTTE became his political USP. It led to his thumping win in 2010. Mahinda returned for his second term as president. This time he consolidated power and inducted his family in the government. Critics faced a crackdown. Supporters got a free pass, even though some of them were accused of murdering journalists. Undeterred, the Rajapaksas launched an ambitious rebuilding effort. They cleared several big-ticket infrastructure projects, including the Hambantota port in their hometown. Once a crown jewel, now a case study on Chinese debt. And a mistake that Mahinda is still paying a price for. The Chinese loans drove him out of office in 2015. Charges of corruption tainted Mahinda's reputation. He was accused of taking bribes from Beijing. Nothing could be proven, but Mahinda lost his political capital. 4 years later, the Rajapaksas made a comeback. The 2019 Easter bombings shook up Sri Lanka. Terrorism and national security became the top election issue. And Sri Lankans welcomed the Rajapaksas as war heroes. Mahinda floated a new political outfit. His younger brother, Gotabaya, was made the face of the campaign. They won a 2/3 majority. In 2019, the Rajapaksas returned to power. Mahinda as prime minister, Gotabaya as president, their political clout as restored. But the Chinese debt caught up with them. Sri Lanka's economic collapse has turned these war heroes into villains. Mahinda is out of power again, and the future of the political dynasty he built looks uncertain.
Do you know what's the most important thing about leadership? Showing up, because that's half the job done. Leaders must be visible in times of crisis, and that's what Vladimir Putin did today. He showed up, not alone, but with the full might of the Russian army. Let me show you these pictures. This was Moscow's Red Square earlier today. Thousands of Russian soldiers were marching in formation. Cutting-edge weapons were paraded. Generals, ministers, spy masters, Russia's most powerful men were in attendance. Now, every Victory Day is special in Moscow. It marks Germany's surrender to the Soviet Union in 1945, basically the end of World War II. For Russians, today is all about sacrifices. They lost 27 million people during the war, more than any other country, 27 million. But history tends to forget those sacrifices. You hear more about Dunkirk or Normandy, but very little about Kursk or Stalingrad. In reality, the war was won on the Eastern Front. It was the Soviet army that captured Berlin. Victory Day celebrates that achievement. It's all about remembering the past. Well, usually it is, not today. Today was all about the present. You see, in the 1940s, Russia did not want war. It was forced upon them. But in 2022, places have been swapped. In today's war, Russia is the aggressor. And today's parade reflected that role reversal. It was all about projecting power. 11,000 soldiers, 131 weapons, 77 fighter jets. That's what Russia showcased at the parade today. It was a message to Ukraine and the West. Do not take us lightly. That's what Moscow was saying. And sending that message was this man, Russian President Vladimir Putin. He walked around the Red Square, he reviewed the parade, and then he addressed his people. As expected, the Putin we heard was combative.
An absolutely unacceptable threat was created for us, and moreover, just next to our borders. Everything indicated that a clash with neo-Nazis, on whom the United States and its younger partners staked, was inevitable. I repeat, we saw how the military infrastructure was being developed, how hundreds of foreign advisors began to work. There were regular deliveries of most modern weapons from NATO countries. The danger grew every day. Russia has preemptively repulsed an aggression. It was a forced, timely, and the only correct decision.
A couple of things to note here. Number one, wasn't Putin supposed to be struggling with his health? That's what every Western publication said. Remember, Putin has cancer, Putin has Parkinson's. Clearly, that doesn't appear to be the case. He was walking fine, he was speaking fine. So maybe all those Western reports were simply wrong. Number two, Putin keeps talking about neo-Nazis in Ukraine. It may be a stretch, but who exactly is he referring to? Perhaps these soldiers, they belong to the Azov regiment. Right now, they're fighting alongside Ukraine's army, but their ideology is problematic. The Azov fighters are neo-Nazis. They use Nazi symbols, Nazi war cries, even Nazi war tactics. This regiment operates mostly in the East. There's no denying their ideology or their brutality. But how powerful are they? Reports say they have between 900 and 2,500 members. Strong, but not strong enough to influence the rulers in Kiev. So Putin's remarks are true about the neo-Nazis, but they're also an exaggeration. Point number three to note. What was the big takeaway from today's parade? That Putin is not stepping back. He wants a military victory in the East, and to do that, he needs the West to stay away, to stop sending weapons. And what's the best way to warn your rivals? Either you test a powerful weapon or you flaunt them in a parade. The question is, did Ukraine get the message? Well, President Zelensky too released a video today, very different from Putin's. No big parades, no lethal weapons. This was a classic walk and talk. You can see Zelensky casually strolling through the empty roads of Kiev, but his message was far from casual.
Very soon there will be 2 victory days in Ukraine, and someone will not have even one left. We won then, we will win now too. And Khreshchatyk Street will see the parade of victory, the victory of Ukraine. Congratulations on the victory day over Nazism. Glory to Ukraine.
Notice how the endgame has changed. First it was survival, then it was a negotiated settlement, and now Zelensky is talking about victory. Where does this confidence come from? His army did repel the attack on Kiev, but a bigger attack is unfolding in the east. And repelling that is not going to be easy. Zelensky needs to be 100% focused on that battle, which raises another question. How does he have time for all of these video shoots? Has Zelensky just become the mascot for this war? Or is he still the commander-in-chief? Sure, the information war is important, but retweets don't win you wars. Tactics do. And what exactly is Zelensky's tactic here? He's clearly feeling more confident. The question is why. One reason could be the American support. Just like Zelensky, Biden too has changed strategy, remember. In February, the White House said Kiev falling was a real possibility. By April, the Pentagon was talking about victory. Listen to this.
That Kyiv falling is a real possibility, and we've continued to see Russia's progression, even as we've seen resistance on the ground.
They believe that we can win. We believe that we can win. They can win if they have the right equipment, the right support, and we're going to do everything we can.
And that's what America is doing, flooding Ukraine with more and more weapons. So naturally, Ukraine feels emboldened. But what is Joe Biden's endgame here? He wants to use this war to weaken Russia, to deplete their arsenal, to isolate their economy. And so far, he's succeeded. Russia has been engaged in this battlefield for more than 70 days now. They've lost warships, dozens of tanks, not to mention thousands of soldiers that Putin does not want to talk about. Technically, Russia can still salvage this. They could stop with the conquest of Donbass. But at what cost? By then, Russia will be reduced to a middle power. So it's a lose-lose game for Vladimir Putin and also for Europe, if they're not careful. And this is very interesting. Before this war, Europe was looking for strategic autonomy. They'd had enough of US hegemony. They wanted to decide their own future. They were even talking about a European army. Now, this war changes a lot of those calculations. Dealing with Russia is not an option anymore. Neither is dealing with China. So Europe has been boxed in. They must rely on the United States of America. Just think about this. Germany is planning to spend $1 billion on defense. Where do you think all that money will go? To American defense contractors. So this war has done the US a favor because their influence was waning in Europe, because the NATO was becoming obsolete. Well, not anymore. Now you have Sweden and Finland considering NATO membership, applying for it, possibly. Such geopolitical plays are not new. Think back to the Vietnam War or the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Big powers fighting proxy wars to weaken their rivals is not new. But also remember what those power plays did to Vietnam, what they did to Afghanistan. Russia's Victory Day was a warning against that sort of thing, against expansionism, against big power rivalries. But here's what we say. Both Putin and Biden would do well to study those days of the World War. 50 million people died for needless political ambitions. More than 7 decades later, it seems little has changed. Now to Pakistan, where every day seems to come with a new crisis. Their economy is in a shambles, inflation is squeezing the poor, there's joblessness, and what appears to be a lack of trust in the system. I'm referring to a certain headline-making rally that happened over the weekend. Where is Pakistan's parliament then? Pakistan's parliament stands as a dysfunctional body. 123 parliamentarians of Imran Khan's party have resigned. That's 123 missing members in a parliament of 342. In other words, there is no opposition, or for that matter, no leader of opposition. The parliament met today. One member called former Prime Minister Imran Khan a threat to Pakistan. Also on the day's agenda was highlighting the quote-unquote grave concern among the public. That's for non-payment of stipend to trainees in hospitals. You see, the non-payment of stipend is just one issue. Pakistan is dealing with hundreds of such issues, like the shortage of essential supplies. Today, Pakistan was forced to ban the export of sugar because there isn't enough at home. There's also a shortage of oil and flour. How Pakistan ran out of these items is also an interesting story. During Ramadan, the new government of Shehbaz Sharif reduced the prices of food items like sugar, flour, oil. So people ran to stores to hoard. And before anyone realized, the shelves were wiped. The stocks were out. The newly announced ban on sugar will go on to hit Pakistan's economy further. Last year, Pakistan exported sugar and sugar confectionery worth $153 million. Now, that money is not going to come in as long as the ban stays, at least not until further notice. Which countries import sugar from Pakistan? Afghanistan, Oman, Kenya, Nigeria. They will all feel the burn because of Pakistan's uncertain policies and politics. Back in Pakistan, the country is obsessing over a certain video clip. Let me play it out for you.
नहीं लेकिन वो चेक करनी चाहिए था ना, अगर तुम तो थे नहीं उसको लाइटिंग उससे बड़ी गंदी थी उनकी ARY की सुपर्ब लाइटिंग आई मस्ट से हाँ ये था
ये आपको पता है इसको आधा घंटा पहले ARY वाले को बताया अभी आधे घंटे में आया सारा नहीं
देखो लाइटिंग जो है ना इज एवरीथिंग अगर आपकी लाइटिंग ठीक नहीं है सारा आपका सारा अजीब सी कोई
This was Imran Khan talking about lighting and crisp questions, most important issues, clearly. How they can be a differentiator in an interview. We agree on the technicality. We're being told that this clip is from before an address. It's one of those hot mic cases. It comes at a time when Imran Khan is planning a march to the capital city of Islamabad. It's supposed to take place later this month. And reports say the plan is to bring some 1.5 million people to Islamabad, flood the capital, choke major urban centres. It is Imran Khan's protest against the government of Shehbaz Sharif. So this is what Pakistan looks like today. A lot of small crises, but a story that doesn't add up. But talking about Imran Khan, how can we forget his courtship of Saudi Arabia? It was a spectacular failure, you might remember it. Not only did Riyadh dump Pakistan, they seem to have found a new ally in the region. I'm talking about India. You see, every relationship has an adjective. India and Bangladesh, brotherly. India and America, we say natural allies. How would you describe India and Saudi Arabia? Perhaps steady. There's a lot of potential, but things have never really taken off. Pretty soon that could change because India and Saudi Arabia are pursuing defense cooperation. Last year was the first joint naval exercise. This year, it is an overseas deployment. Ships from India's first training squadron have reached Saudi Arabia. INS Tir, INS Sujata, Coast Guard ship Sarthi, also INS Tarangini. These ships will stay in Jeddah for 4 days and then they will continue their 5-nation tour. Now, this deployment is not happening in a vacuum. In the month of February, a Saudi naval delegation had visited India. They took part in the Milan naval drills. Before that, Indian vessels sailed to Saudi Arabia for joint exercises. So the defense cooperation has been growing. The question is, where does it go from here? Until now, oil was the binding factor. Saudi Arabia was a top oil producer. India was a top oil consumer. So the relationship had a commercial angle. But oil is not going to last forever. Saudi Arabia is already looking to diversify their economy. And if that happens, where does the relationship go? What can be the new oil? Perhaps weapons. And this time, the roles could be reversed. Saudi Arabia does not produce weapons of its own. India, on the other hand, does. So this time, the trade could happen in reverse. I have some numbers. Let me show you those numbers. Saudi Arabia is the 8th largest military spender. Their defense budget is 6.6% of their GDP. For 2022, that's around $46 billion. That's what they spent on defense. And don't forget, Saudi Arabia is at war right now. They're fighting against the Houthi rebels in Yemen. So chances are their defense spending will keep rising. That makes Saudi Arabia a lucrative market for any defense exporter. The problem is, there is a monopoly, a Western monopoly. And these numbers should make it clear. In the last decade, 60% of Saudi arms came from the US, 18% from Britain, 8% from France, and 2% each from Spain and Germany. That's 88% of the imports from the West. What about China? They made up just 0.8%. America has successfully cultivated this loyalty. But lately things are changing. Joe Biden is no fan of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and from what we hear, the feeling is mutual. So Saudi Arabia is exploring new avenues. In January, they reached out to China. Both countries agreed to expand military cooperation. Even before that, there were rumors of joint projects. Apparently, China and Saudi Arabia are building missiles and drones. If that's true, where does that leave India? With a lot of work to do. Reports say Saudi Arabia and the UAE are interested in the BrahMos missiles. Remember, India has already sold those missiles to the Philippines. But West Asia is a different ballgame. It is the most volatile region on earth where war is just one bad day away. So Saudi Arabia's requirements are very specific. And right now they're beyond India's capability. Or so we understand. Having said that, things are moving in the right direction. High-level visits by military delegations, joint drills, overseas deployments, all of this can be a prelude to a strong defense partnership. For India, that would be a strategic coup. And I'll tell you why. In 2015, some of you might remember, Saudi Arabia announced a new military alliance, the Islamic Military Counter-Terrorism Coalition. Saudi Arabia announced that. It was a coalition of 41 members. It's based in Riyadh. In 2017, Pakistan's former army chief Rahil Sharif was named the commander-in-chief of this coalition. It was a big win for Pakistan. Many thought it would kickstart military cooperation between Islamabad and Riyadh. As it turned out, nothing happened. During this time, Saudi Arabia grew closer to India. The key is to build on that, to conceive a long-term partnership. In this case, that involves thinking beyond oil. For instance, Davos in the desert. It is the Crown Prince's project to diversify Saudi economy. Indian investors could buy into that dream. Without such a shared interest, no relationship can prosper. Oil plays that role today. Finding the next oil will be key for both sides. On to the Philippines now. The voting is over, the counting is on. More than 60% of the votes have been tallied, and it looks like a dictator's son will become the next president. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is on his way to achieving a historic win. He shares his name with his father, who was once a dictator. Not everybody is thrilled by the prospect of Marcos Jr.'s victory. There's more that's bothering them. More than 1,800 voting machines malfunctioned during polling today. Our next report has all the details.
The voting is over, but the result is a mere formality. An unofficial vote count confirms what opinion polls had predicted. A dictator's son is set to become the next president of the Philippines. Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. is looking at a big victory. Over 65 million voters cast their ballots today. All the votes are yet to be counted, but Marcos Jr. is already miles ahead of his closest rival. The former senator has over 20 million votes. The current Vice President, Leni Robredo, is the challenger. She has received just a little more than 9 million votes so far. Marcos Jr. is likely to hold on to his lead. His victory will mean the return of the Marcos clan to mainstream politics. This is despite the family's history of human rights abuses and corruption. Marcos Jr.'s father, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., was a dictator. He was accused of gross human rights abuses and corruption. Thousands of his opponents were arrested, tortured, and killed in the 1970s. The Marcoses plundered as much as $10 billion from the state. But the young voters don't really care about their dark past. More than 50% of the voting population is below 41 years of age. That's around 30 million voters. They were born after the martial law was lifted in the Philippines. The young voters are buying into the promises of prosperity by Marcos Jr. He is running on a platform of unity and vowed to provide more jobs, less inflation, and more investment in agriculture and infrastructure. His election may look like a certainty, but a controversy could set roadblocks in his victory lap. Across the country, thousands of voting machines malfunctioned. Going by one claim, more than 1,800 machines didn't work like they were supposed to. At some places, Voters claim their ballots had been tampered with. Amid such allegations, none of the candidates are going to breathe easy until they hear the final tally. It could take days for all the ballots to be counted.
We say elections are a domestic affair. Technically, yes, they are. But the results can reshape international politics. You just saw what's happening in the Philippines. Their new leader is pro-China. Later this month, Australia is also voting. Opinion polls say the Labour Party is winning, which means the China hawk, Scott Morrison, could be voted out of power. Well, that's 1 month, 2 elections, and possibly 2 wins for China. Beijing senses that the tide is changing. First, the war in Ukraine, now the election of pro-China leaders in the neighborhood. This could be their opportunity to gain some momentum. And that's what China's vice foreign minister did. His target was the Quad. Beijing is accusing the US of creating exclusive groups against them. Listen to what they said. If this is not an Asia-Pacific version of NATO's eastward expansion, then what is? Such a strategy, if left unchecked, would bring horrible consequences and push the Asia-Pacific over the edge of an abyss. Strong words there, quite dramatic too. He's talking about checking the rise of the Quad. How does China plan to do that? One strategy is by creating choke points, basically Chinese ports and presence across the Indo-Pacific. It's already a big network. The Solomon Islands, Malaysia, Indonesia, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Gwadar in Pakistan, Djibouti in Eastern Africa. These are all Chinese choke points. On paper, they're Chinese investment projects. In reality, they have dual use. So what do these choke points achieve? A, they boost Chinese surveillance, and B, they expand China's blue water capabilities. What does that mean? Blue water capabilities refers to a navy's ability to sail far from home. Like the US Navy, their warships sail all over the world. Before them, Britain did the same. You see, naval power is key to global domination. And China's naval power is suspect. Their carriers are clunky. Their submarines are too loud. So the PLA Navy is still a work in progress. Having said that, the gap is closing and closing fast. With compliant leaders, China could dominate the Indo-Pacific. Which is why the domestic politics is so important. The Philippines will have a pro-China leader. Australia could have an indifferent leader. And South Korea will soon have a China hawk. Beijing is looking to take advantage of this period. On Monday, they wrapped up a military drill near Taiwan. Bombers and anti-submarine aircraft were used. Last week, 18 Chinese jets entered Taiwan's air defense zone. This is the backdrop for the upcoming Quad summit. A world focused on Ukraine, an Indo-Pacific going through a political churn, and a China looking to take advantage. How should the Quad respond to this? In 2 ways. One, reaffirm the commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. We get tired of hearing it every time, but that's what sets the Quad apart from China. The open and free ideology. The Quad must emphasize that this ideology is not affected by domestic politics. It is part of the national character of each member state. And 2, challenge China's choke points. How did China get so many assets across the Indo-Pacific? Because the alliance of democracies looked the other way. China trapped smaller nations in debt traps. When they could not repay, China took over strategic assets. The Quad must offer a solution to this problem. Perhaps they can start with Sri Lanka. If you want to beat China, you must offer alternatives. Not just political, but financial too. I'm talking about cheaper loans, transparent investments, resilient supply chains. To beat China, you need to beat their system. If not, more Indo-Pacific nations could slip into their hold. Now, they say change is the only constant. The only way to remain relevant is to constantly change with the times. And this is not a prologue to a lecture on philosophy. What I'm talking about, or what I'm going to talk about next, is law. It's about how laws must change with the times to remain relevant and effective. And I've said this before in the context of gun laws in the US, how human rights in America are being compromised because the country has refused to change an age-old law. Tonight, I bring you a positive story, and this one's from India. India is trying to change an age-old law to protect human rights and the freedom of nearly 1.4 billion people. The government of India is rethinking the sedition law. The Narendra Modi-led government has told India's apex court that it will be re-examining the sedition law in India. First things first, what is the sedition law? This law states that a person commits the act of sedition if he or she brings or attempts to bring hatred, contempt, or disaffection towards the government. Now, this law is vaguely worded and it's widely abused. And we'll get to that in a bit. First, let's look at the origins of this law. Sedition dates back to the British Raj in India. The law was drafted by British historian and politician Thomas Babington Macaulay. The name may ring a bell. Macaulay is the same man who pushed to make English the medium of instruction in the Indian education system. He was an imperialist, if there ever was one. And he defined sedition in these words: whoever by words, either spoken or written, or by signs, or by visible representation or otherwise, brings or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt, or excites or attempts to excite disaffection towards the government established by law in India. Like we said, the words are vague, because the idea was to abuse it as much as possible to suppress dissent. Why? To tame anti-imperialism in India. The sedition law came into effect in 1870. In the years that followed, the British used sedition to crack down on India's freedom movement and India's freedom fighters. Mahatma Gandhi was accused of sedition. So was Lokmanya Tilak. In fact, anyone who raised a voice against the British imperialists was tried for sedition in India. But somehow, even after 75 years of independence, sedition remains an ugly truth of modern India. If accused of sedition, you don't get bail. You could go to jail for life. Even if you manage to get out in some years, you'll be barred from applying for a government job, or for that matter, traveling abroad. In 2020, 73 cases of sedition were filed in India, 93 in 2019, at least 70 in 2018. And all of these cases, there were just 2 convictions, which only goes on to show the disutility of this law. Now, I'm not saying that sedition cannot be used to combat secessionism or terrorism. It can. But the fact is, in more cases, police fail to file a charge sheet because most sedition cases are baseless. You see, in a country of 1.4 billion Indians, there are 1.4 billion versions of truth sometimes. And any of these truths can seem seditious to someone. So what happens next? In 2018, the Law Commission of India highlighted this problem in its report. It said that in a democracy, singing from the same songbook is not a benchmark of patriotism. One must indulge in constructive criticism or debates. Expressions used in such thoughts might be harsh and unpleasant to some, but that does not render the actions to be branded sedition. There is no doubt that sedition is antithetical to freedom of speech and expression. In fact, India has been fighting this law for quite some time. In 2011, a private member's bill against sedition was introduced in the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of parliament. In 2015, a private member's bill was introduced in the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament. In 2021, the apex court of India stepped in. The Chief Justice questioned whether sedition was necessary even after 75 years of independence. Well, today the government has an answer. The affidavit filed with the Supreme Court reads, and I quote, "The Honourable Prime Minister believes that at a time when our nation is marking Azadi Ka Mahotsav, we need to, as a nation, work even harder to shed colonial baggage that has passed its utility, which includes outdated colonial laws and practices." And then it goes on to say, "The Government of India, being fully cognizant of various views being expressed on the subject of sedition, and also having considered the concerns of civil liberties and human rights, while committed to maintain and protect the sovereignty and integrity of this great nation, has decided to re-examine and reconsider the provisions of Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code." Well, that's the section that deals with sedition. It may be a matter of time before this section is removed or rewritten to protect Indians from legal abuse, to protect journalists who are often slapped with sedition for their reportage. So it's a good day for India, because at the end of the day, a re-examination of the sedition law will only uphold democracy and protect the cacophony of conflicting opinions the world's biggest democracy comes with. So 3 cheers for this move. Let's also take a look at what else is making headlines across the world. This is Gravitas Global Headlines.
At least 48 people killed in attack by gunmen in 3 villages in northwest Nigeria's Zamfara, which have been terrorized for years by criminal gangs. After a brief pause, Moscow resumed its shelling of the Azovstal steel plant in Ukraine's Mariupol. This comes a day after Mariupol authorities said that they have evacuated all the civilians from the steel plant site. China's export growth slumped in April to its lowest level in almost 2 years as a COVID-19 resurgence shuttered factories, sparked transport curbs and caused congestion at key ports. Violence marred polling in the Philippines presidential election as 3 security guards were killed and another injured after gunmen attacked a polling station in southern Philippines. The Indian rupee has plunged to an all-time low, with rising oil prices and a strengthening US dollar weighing heavy on the rupee. Hundreds of protesters marched in Mexico City to voice their anger over rising violence against women and demand justice for femicide victims. A 6.3 magnitude earthquake struck the coast of Taiwan. There were no immediate reports of damage. This is the 5th earthquake above the magnitude of 6 to hit Taiwan in 2022. Firefighters in New Mexico are struggling to contain a blaze that has been burning for more than a month now, with 170 properties destroyed and 16,000 houses evacuated.
With that, it's a wrap. We're leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks very much for watching.
And medal for the dedicated service, a service dog called Patron.